For those of you who have been involved in politics and are involved in politics, I very much enjoy being out on the grassroots level myself. I first met Russell, though, through the academic end of things. I was teaching at a Christian college in California, now defunct. The two statements are not related. I taught there and it's now defunct. I was then working part-time for a Christian think tank in Los Angeles. One of the assignments I was given was to read Russell Kirk's Enemies of the Permanent Things and give a report on it to the executive director of the organization. I had known Russell Kirk's name before, but I had never really seriously read him. And in an intellectual sense, it was love at first sight. Once I read Enemies of the Permanent Things, that led to other things. I ended up teaching at Northwood University, coming to Michigan in 1976, and was fascinated by the fact that Mecosta was only about 40 miles away from Midland. It took me a few months to get myself settled in at Northwood, and then decide to try to contact Russell Kirk. I figured somebody that prominent probably would have an unlisted number, or you'd have to go through several layers of people in order to approach him. I found it very simple, just called the number and asked for him and was given him. And that began the whole relationship between us. I found Russell Kirk one of the very few people who could keep me happily silent by the hour. As one who's been a politician, history professor, a clergyman, I'm happiest when talking, as you might imagine. But I could just listen to him enthralled by the hour. I did my doctoral work under Russell Kirk and was absolutely fascinated by him. So I'll stop at that stage. It was very intriguing, by the way, a brief opening comment on Russell Kirk's background. He was not raised in an intellectual, upscale home at all. He was raised in Plymouth, Michigan, near the rail yards. His father was a rail worker, and there were no university graduates in the family at all. But he was raised in a family in which books mattered to people. They counted, and so he had books available in his home for the time he was a young boy. And this is one of these inexplicable things in life. Some people take to things other people do not take to them. Russell Kirk, from a very early age, took to reading, took to learning, was fascinated by books. He went through Michigan State University for his undergraduate work during the Depression, a very rough time for anyone in Michigan especially. He had to live the literal poor student existence, attic room, peanut butter sandwich diet. But he had again that thirst for learning. Moving on to my remarks. In his 1999 book, Lee Edwards, in the conservative movement, the conservative revolution, that the movement that remade America is talked about by Lee Edwards, he presented 3 levels through which the conservative movement filtered down to actually change everyday life for people in this country. At the top level, you have the thinkers, the people of ideas. They're the ones who lay the foundation, if you want to switch things around and say from the bottom up, but it's the thinkers who come first. You don't have people acting for no reason at all, assuming you have individuals who are not demented in some way. There are reasons why people act the way they do. There are reasons why people are taking the steps that they are in life, why they're saying what they're saying. So the men of ideas came first. Then these ideas are implemented, are popularized by people at the second layer, and then at the bottom layer, you have the implementation into public policy of these ideas. Russell Kirk stated it takes about a generation in the United States and in England for ideas to filter through to public policy and effect constructive, lasting changes. France acts very quickly. In France, ideas crop up and they're implemented through revolutionary means very rapidly. They don't last. Lee Edwards, in his book, set forth Russell Kirk as a prime example of a man on the level of the thinkers, on the idea level, then to give you some ideas, some suggestions as to how he viewed the other 2 levels. Edwards suggested that William Buckley, National Review, would be a very good example of the taking of these ideas and then interpreting them and popularizing them for the general public. You can look at others today with whom you may disagree on an issue or so, but that these are largely conservative people who are attacking liberalism and trying to lay a good conservative foundation, people such as Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity. These again are on that second level. They take the ideas, they interpret them, they popularize them. And then when you come to the implementation of ideas into public policy, now you're talking about somebody obviously such as Ronald Reagan. Or you could look today at people such as Chris Christie, and Scott Walker, John Kasich. Russell Kirk was primarily, of course, on the level of ideas, although he did do some work at interpreting and popularizing, and he was involved in active politics to some extent. He served as a justice of the peace, for example, when Michigan had that office in existence. He was a member of state conventions, and he involved himself in a number of political campaigns, including one of mine, an abortive campaign for Congress. But he was involved in Robert Taft's campaign for president, in Barry Goldwater's, Ronald Reagan's. So he did operate at all three of these levels, but more than anything else, Russell Kirk was a man of ideas. He laid the foundation. He set the stage. When you look at Kirk's books, you will see, if you read them all, a progression upward of his spiritual beliefs. Russell Kirk was raised in a home which was not religious. His family was moral, they were people of integrity, they were hardworking, they had retained the effects of Christianity, but it wasn't actively being presented and promulgated in the home. Kirk, in his years in college and in years in the Army, was an agnostic, frankly. He always said that he was not positive enough to be an atheist. An atheist has to affirm something positively, and he could not. But that agnosticism changed. And by the time he was writing, when The Conservative Mind came out in 1953, for example, he had moved up to a second stage, which I would call civilizational Christianity. He believed that a civilization, in order to survive, has to have a spiritual foundation. Christopher Dawson, the English writer, made the statement that a civilization cannot long survive the dying of belief in a transcendent order that brought the culture into being. Civilizations arise on some kind of a foundation. Western civilization arose on essentially a Christian foundation, you may say Judeo-Christian. Essentially on that foundation, Western civilization grew and prospered and flourished. Kirk had a firm belief, finally, in the middle stages and later stages of his life, in Christianity as a system. He firmly stated his belief, for example, in the fact that Christianity was the foundation of Western civilization. He stated, "Yet out of the ruins of Rome grew the highest order of liberty man has known, Christian freedom. The depressed masses of the proletariat were given hope by the promise of Christ. The barbarians were taught restraint by the word. Humanity learned the lesson of the suffering servant and came to know the service of God is perfect freedom." He did have, to bring it into contemporary politics, a firm belief in market economics. That's already been stated. Russell Kirk believed that economics, though, also rests on a Christian foundation, as everything in our Western civilization, certainly historically, has rested on a Christian foundation and should continue to do so if it will continue to thrive. He wrote a couple of books, actually 3 books, on economics, which surprises a lot of people because Russell Kirk certainly is not known as one who was essentially an economist, but he, to use that overworked word, was certainly a polymath, a Renaissance man. It's amazing the number of areas in which Russell Kirk was an expert and could write with convincing expertise. He stated, "In a market economy, healthy competition improves the quality of goods and lowers their prices. This healthy competition is the selling of goods is a major reason why countries with a market economy are prosperous. That's a statement with which a libertarian would not differ. That's a statement in which people are going to find a wide basis for approving of what he stated. But he went on to say that there has to be a foundation of ideas. Economics does not exist in isolation. It does not exist in isolation. It has to rest upon something, or it is meaningless and will degenerate into a crude, crass society. Kirk was a traditionalist, no question about that, but he did put the revelation of God at a higher level. But tradition was very important to Kirk, which marks him as different from many other people who want to change everything each generation. As far as Kirk was concerned, if something has become a tradition, that means that it's been supported by a lot of people for an extended period of time. And so you start off by giving the benefit of the doubt to something which is traditional, then you examine it carefully to see if there are reasons why it should be changed. But again, the benefit of the doubt is always given to tradition. Multiculturalism was mentioned. That is something that certainly aggravated Russell immensely. Multiculturalism has become sort of a modern orthodoxy. You can have people sort of assuming, well, of course we're multicultural. That would drive him up the wall. Of course we're multi-ethnic, yes, but multi-ethnic and multicultural are totally different. If you say that we are a multicultural country, in effect that means we have no foundation under us. That means that we're simply a conglomeration of a whole bunch of ideas existing side by side with nothing which is going to unite us. Variety was very important to Russell, but he also believed firmly, as is stated as you go through the whole 10 principles, that what unites us must be more important than what separates us. The people sitting in here have a variety of interests, a variety of ethnic backgrounds, no doubt. I'm about to say a variety of genders, probably only 2 genders. And yet, I think it is safe to say, though, that there are things that unite us that are more significant than the things which separate us. So Russell Kirk, again, is a giant of thinking. It's amazing to me that he had that I ignored him for as many years as I did, and his impact is most impressive. Comments have been made about people who came to visit his home in Mecosta. Intriguing. You can run into people in central Michigan who have never heard of Russell Kirk, and yet I met people in Mecosta who had come there specifically from various parts of the world as disciples of Russell Kirk. Very intriguingly, for example, I met the grandson of the last Austro-Hungarian emperor who had come to spend time with Russell. And yes, there were refugees from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam in particular. I met 2 young people who were members of one of the noble families of Ethiopia who had fled the communization of that country and had come to Mecosta. I met a man who was serving at the time as an official in the Croatian government. That's when Croatia was still part of Yugoslavia. He had read Kirk's works in Yugoslavia, which at that time still was communist, and had come to study at Kirk's feet. Poles were there. This is going back to when Poland still was communist. So Mecosta really has become sort of a Christian intellectual mecca for people from all around the world. There are students who go there to study constantly. So again, he's an absolutely fascinating man. I've written a book on Kirk, which I would love to be selling here today, but the paperback edition is not out yet. There's a hardback edition which sells for $130 a copy. So I'll stop there.
You'll come and read it to us at that price, right?
Oh, yes.
I wonder if Mr. Kirk had any thoughts or comments on minimum wage, which I think is probably the beginning of the end of free market capitalism.
He did not like the minimum wage because it was an imposition by government of a standard of economics. and that it had bad effects on wages and prices. And besides, he did understand this. If you impose price controls to move on to something else, then that's because you don't like the price. If you don't like the price, that means you think it is too high, so you're bringing it down artificially, which is going to depress production, it's going to depress supply. So he didn't like all those interferences with economic operations.
We just passed a law that children, teenagers, cannot have more than one other teenager in the car, you know? And it's because there's a zero tolerance for the death of teenagers. And that's a value, that's a positive thing, right? You know, but I am absolutely opposed to that law because
He
it
hated the
needs
Russell would say, Russell would have these conversations at his house, like Mr. John Pafford said, all these people would come to his house, and any weekend there might be a dozen or more people there, and Annette would have all these people over for dinner, and all these discussions would crop up about the issue of the day. And we used to talk about, all of us used to talk about all of this kind of stuff, and Russell's stock answer was, number one, each culture, each country, each civilization sorts out its own order, so that democracy is completely unworkable in certain places, and there needs to be a monarchy. There has been a monarchy, and sometimes there is a benevolent dictator. That's all good. But in America, because I took over a family business, and that was the first time I actually had to pay taxes, and I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that businessmen would walk around without punching somebody in the face, you know? and I said, Russell, you know, the government's making more money than I am. And he would say, there's always tension between order and freedom. That was a common phrase, it's in all of his writings. And on the issue of the things you're talking about, I said, well, these taxes are just too big, too high. And he said, taxes maintain the social civil order. So he was willing to make these compromises, to live with just the messiness of living in a democracy where in a certain region or a certain time, the leftists are in control. And his answer would be, I'm sure his answer would be, well, elect Ronald Reagan, you know, get some of our people as precinct delegates, all of that. He was active in local politics, and he would agree with all of our, you know, he was a free market man, all that, limited government man. He would agree with everything, and he would agree the best thing is call the legislator, do what you can, but he was completely opposed to anything that was revolutionary.
And he hated to get into this too deeply. He knew there were people who had to deal with the question you raised, legislators. He backed legislators. He was very friendly with John Engler when he was in the state legislature. Yeah, and then later Joanne Emmons, who served in the state senate. So he understood that these are all issues that would have to be dealt with. Ideally, he thought government was dealing with too many things, which it shouldn't have to. But this was not his main calling, though, to get into this issue, this issue, this issue, this issue. And when a lot of us would be over there talking about these things, he would sit out a lot of these conversations. In fact, he was not a dominant conversationalist, first of all. He married a woman who was. He would sit there quietly and listen. He was a raconteur, a storyteller. He would give formal talks, but he wasn't a dominating conversationalist.